Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about the book Sexual Liberals and the Attack on Feminism, edited by Dorhen, Leidholdt and Janice Raymond, and it was published in 1990. It's being discussed by Karla Mantilla and Marian Rutigliano. So thanks so much, both of you. And over to you first, Karla Mantilla.
Yes, I've read this book, The Sexual Liberals and the Attack on Feminism, and I just kind of wanted to talk today about some of the themes and some of the content in it, which I find to be incredibly important. This book was published in 1990, edited by Dorhen, Leidholdt, and Janice Raymond. It's an edited book of 25 essays by a variety of prominent feminist authors and activists. Next slide, please. The book is based on a 1987 conference at the New York University Law School, and it's based on the speeches and panel presentations at that conference. Sheila Jeffries just let us know before this that the audio of some of the talks are available online, and that all the talks are available on PDF, and that those will be put up on the WDI YouTube. And there'll be a link to the PDF on the of the talks on YouTube, of the video, of the audio. One of the things I wanted to point out was that in the introduction by Dorhen Leidholdt, she notes that the book and the conference on which the book is based are both the inspiration of Sheila Jeffries. So Sheila Jeffries kind of was behind getting this conference together as well as the book. The subject was sexual liberation, which is defined as a set of political beliefs and practices rooted in the assumption that sexual expression is inherently liberating and must be permitted to flourish unchecked, even when it entails the exploitation or brutalization of others. And I have the page numbers for the quotes from the book in parentheses in case people want to see, are able to get a copy of the book. I will say that the book is out of print, but it is available on used bookseller sites for about $50 US or 38 pounds thereabouts, and you can buy it for even more on Amazon. However, it is available, the whole book, as a PDF online at the link below, which will be posted in the chat for if you would like to look at the book. I very much recommend it. It's really a good primer on radical feminism from that time. Next slide, please.
I just to interject, I bought this book. I came out very, very early, like 1969, and went to the first, Michigan's festivals at what was not even the Lamb then. It was like a place before that, and then got caught up, my partner and I, with career and school and stuff like that, and we didn't go after 1981 just because we couldn't, because of all those things. And somewhere in the the early 90s, early mid 90s, we thought about going back, and saw that there were things like BDSM tents, and where women would come out with their backs bloody from being whipped and things like that, and a whole host of other things that I was like, this isn't what I remember. And I found this book, and I'm like, I wonder if this has anything to do with it, and found out that it did.
It definitely does. Yeah, this book really highlights where feminism split and where liberal feminists kind of took over feminism. So I have the next is the table of contents. There are 6 areas, and you'll note that there's a lot of prominent feminists who have essays in it, including Catherine McKinnon, Sheila Jeffries, Andrea Dworkin, Phyllis Chesler, the 2 co-editors, Janice Raymond and Dorhen Leidholdt, Mary Daly, Sonia Johnson. So it's well worth reading. First, I'm going to talk about some common themes that I found throughout the book. After that, I'll just talk about some selected essays that I found to have particularly interesting radical feminist points, many of which we kind of don't talk about so much anymore. Next slide, please. So some of the themes throughout the book are same versus difference. That is, whether women's equality is based on women being the same as men and therefore should have kind of one-to-one equality, or different from men. Another theme throughout the book is the idea of agency and choice, which is something that sex liberals and liberal feminists focus on, as opposed to social constraints, which is the idea that radical feminists focus more on the social, political, and economic factors that affect and shape those choices. A third theme that kind of ran throughout the book was the idea of privacy versus equality, which many laws, and I don't know how much this is true in the UK, but in the United States, many laws about helping women, giving women's rights, were based on the concept of privacy rather than equality, and that there's a lot of ramifications of that which are not always good. And the last theme, which really does run throughout the whole book, is the idea of sexual freedom or sexual equality is more important for women's liberation. Whether sexual freedom or sexual equality is the important thing to focus on, where sex liberals seeing freedom as a fundamental value, and radical feminists often see freedom empowering male sex rights rather than resulting in more liberation for women. Next slide, please. So on the theme of same versus difference, it's a fundamental problem for feminism. Equality is too often defined as women being the same as men and therefore treated the same as men. It denies the ways that women are different, especially in terms of biology, reproductive biology, maternity leave, women's sports, or in terms of vulnerability to sexual violence. I think that has kind of paved the way for some of the transgenderism, where women are not seen as so the same, that where areas where we're different are ignored and run over by transgender or trans rights activists. I thought it was interesting to note that women are clearly not the same in terms of committing sexual and other forms of violence. So even if, to the extent that women, that's also eroded and erased when moving into like transgender ideology. So
when you say same versus different and equality, is there like, a standard that's being applied? It's we're the same by XY standard, or we're different by XY standard.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I see what you're saying. Like this, obviously the standard is men. That's one of the major failings, is that, are women as good as men, or are we different from men? But it's never, are men as good as women? Is that kind of what you're getting at, Marian?
Yeah. Like a man says, well, now I can punch you. It's just, and I always, you can tell men, it's like, no, we don't want to be equal to you. We want you to be equal to us.
Right. Exactly. And that's hardly said, certainly not in mainstream or liberal feminism. So this concept was talked about a lot in the essay Liberalism and the Death of Feminism by Catherine McKinnon. She writes, under this notion of sex equality, we were given the choice of being the same as men, which is the left's choice for us, or different from men, which was the right's choice. We were told that the left's choice was clearly better and the only route to true equality. So she talks a lot about a court case called Sears versus the EEOC. Now, Sears was a major retail store throughout the United States. There were, it was very, very big at the time. And the EEOC stands for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a section of the government that is supposed to help create equal opportunity for, anyway. So in 1986, there was a suit by the EEOC against Sears because women throughout Sears had lower paid and less prestigious jobs. The interesting thing that McKinnon points out in this chapter is that scholars of women's history testified on both sides. In other words, one, Rosalind Rosenberg, testified that women were different. Women were fundamentally different because of our commitment to home and family, and that married women and women with small children have different goals and don't want to have as high paying jobs as men. Alice Kessler was on that women are the same as men, But she did say that women's choices are kind of made in the context of what work opportunities are available. So if commissions can only happen at times when women do need to be taking care of small children, that is exclusive. At any rate, the EEOC lost the case because they failed to prove that Sears had a pattern of discrimination. But related to this, McKinnon asks which theory best explains why why men are dominant and women are subordinate. She says, is it the theory that says that women are the same as men, or the theory that says women are different than men? And I don't think she comes down on either side very clearly, but that's certainly a tension she talks about a lot. Next slide, please. So then another theme was the theme of agency and choice versus social constraints. Janice Raymond talks about this in her essay, Sexual and Reproductive Liberalism. She says that liberal feminists are overly invested in discourses about choice, that liberal feminists talk about how women choose prostitution, pornography, and surrogacy. The book talks a lot about the problems of surrogacy, which is, only kind of coming to light these days more, but it was talked about then. Raymond says that liberal feminists pay little to no attention to the way choices are constrained, and that, interestingly, liberal feminists were complaining a lot at the time that radical feminists talked too much about the constraints that women experience. And really were accusing radical feminists of turning women into victims by talking about these constraints. So she says, to expose the victimization of women by men is to be blamed for making women into passive victims. This was really common at the time to accuse radical feminists of turning women into victims, of pathologizing them as victims. Raymond responds that one could recognize women as victims of surrogacy, pornography, and prostitution without stripping them of agency and without depriving them of some ability to act under oppressive conditions. She notes where the right to choose is defended as something that's liberating for women and where it's not. She says liberals restrict their defense of women's agency to pornography and surrogacy, institutions that uphold male supremacy. So she basically says that when the women's choices collude with patriarchal structures, liberal feminists defend them as free choice and agency. Next slide.
Yeah, she said, and all the essays in this book talk about women having agency, even under the worst of circumstances. I mean, I always use the, analogy of you're a prisoner in a POW camp. This hierarchical oppression, and you can try to make the best deal for yourself to make your life easier. You can try being nice to the guards. You can try having a relationship with a less savage guard. You can try, a whole lot of things just to make your life, easier, to ameliorate the horrible things that are happening. But you're still a prisoner, and you're only doing those things to make being in prison bearable, or to make it feel like you aren't really in prison. Oh, he's one of the good guards. So prisoners can make decisions, but all those decisions are in the context of being imprisoned. And, the essays in this book talk about that in a whole bunch of different circumstances, that you're always making decisions. The woman who gets sucked into prostitution, it's the only option left, or it's her best option left. She always has agency. But the choices that are available to her are not, are determined by, the male patriarchal society.
Right. And it's crazy that liberal feminists want to focus so much on the choices and agency of people, women, in these incredibly constrained conditions. So, you see somebody in a horrific, prison or concentration camp, to focus on, well, they had choice, kind of misses the point, misses really what's the big picture of what's going on.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the next theme is that laws addressing women's rights are often based on privacy rather than sex equality, or on opposing sex discrimination. McKinnon talks a lot about this in her essay, Liberalism and the Death of Feminism. She said that she mentioned that laws that were made or attempted to be made on the basis of sexual equality, for example, the McKinnon-Dworkin anti-pornography ordinance, were opposed by conservatives because turns out they disliked sex equality a lot more than they disliked pornography. So even though they were against pornography and wanted laws against that, they didn't like the laws being based on sex equality, as was the McKinnon-Dworkin anti-pornography ordinance. The same laws, she points out, were opposed by the left because it turns out they liked speech, which women being used in pornography they called speech, a great deal more than they liked sex equality. So neither side was interested in enacting any laws ensuring women's sex equality. She also noted something that's important, I think, is that equality cannot apply to sexuality because sexuality occurs in private. And since the private sphere is made into a realm where is off limits for government regulation or any kind of sense of rules or laws, that means that the realm where most of women's abuse occurs, rape, incest, domestic violence, is off limits to any kind of equality or any kind of justice. So I thought that was a really important point. Another chapter or essay in the book by Twist Butler on the connection between abortion and pornography, she notes that both of those, abortion rights and the right of men to use pornography, are based on privacy, and that if abortion was based on sex equality for women, there would be a better grounds for women to oppose pornography, because as it stands now, at least in the United States, the idea, if you oppose abortion rights, they're based on privacy, then there's no grounds to oppose pornography, which is also based on privacy. Next slide, please. So again, throughout the book, really are the concepts of sexual freedom and sex libertarianism versus sexual equality. Sheila Jeffreys, in her essay "Sexology and Anti-Feminism," distinguishes between sex liberals and sex libertarians. Sex liberals subscribe to the agenda of sexual tolerance, to the idea that sex is necessarily good and positive, and that censorship is a bad thing. Sexual libertarians go even further, advocating for the, quote, outer fringes of sexuality, such as sadomasochism, with the belief that, quote, sexual minorities are in the forefront of creating the sexual revolution. So sexual liberals and sexual libertarians, because they focus on freedom rather than equality of civil rights, have led feminism to being a movement of sexual liberation rather than women's liberation, which ends up being about male sex rights to harass, abuse, objectify, and degrade their chosen sexual objects, rather than about dignity and equality for all people, especially women. Jeffreys, or Sheila, I guess we'll call her Sheila since she's here. Sheila also talks about how important it is that sexual pleasure is not always a positive experience. And she wishes that there was a word to describe sexual response that isn't positive, because sexual pleasure for women can be experienced as simultaneously pleasurable and as humiliation and betrayal. Next slide, please. Another chapter or essay that talks a lot about these concepts of sexual freedom versus sexual equality is by Evelina Giobe, Confronting the Liberal Lies About Prostitution. I wanted to talk about this because there are two organizations that existed in opposition to each other, and I don't think a lot of women know about them these days. I mean, obviously women who are older like me may. But there were two competing organizations representing sex liberal and radical feminist ideologies. One was called Whisper, Women Hurt in Systems of Prostitution Engaged in Revolt. And that organization saw prostitution as objectifying, degrading, and abusive of women, and that prostitution reinforces seeing women as objects for male use. Coyote was the other organization, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. They claim that prostitution is a manifestation of women's sexual freedom and gender equality. Two proponents of that belief system, Arlene Carmen and Howard Moody, wrote a book called Working Women, the Subterranean World of Street Prostitution. In that book, they wrote, this is incredibly ironic, in a society where women are at the threshold of equality with men, beginning to not only enjoy sex, but deciding when and where and with whom to have it, the prostitute becomes the embodiment of that freedom, which until now had only been a fantasy. Yeah, whose fantasy? But it's interesting that they hold the prostituted women up as the pinnacle of women's liberation and freedom. Contrary to their lauding of a prostitution as such a wonderful thing, Whisper conducted an oral history project in 1987, and some of the data from that showed that 90% of women in prostitution were physically abused as children, 75% were sexually abused between the ages of 3 and 14. Of that group, 93% were sexually abused by a family member, and of all women in prostitution, 79% were beaten by pimps, 75% assaulted by Johns, and 71% assaulted multiple times by Johns.
Hey, Karla, there's some discussion in the chat about,
Yeah,
how do we, and how do we engage with men, given we want freedom, we want, equality, all this. How do we engage with men? I mentioned the essay by Sonia Johnson, Taking Our Eyes Off the Guys. She was very, very early in radical feminism, and just basically said she said, men are totally irrelevant now as far as change is concerned, because they won't change. So we can take our eyes off them and look at ourselves to make a new reality right here, right now, in the midst of the old putrescent, collapsing world of the fathers. But as long as we're focused on the men, we're never going to see that the door to our jail cell is open. But if it's open, it's not into patriarchy, but into our own power. So early on, there was, some women would use the term abandonment, but in this book, Sonia Johnson had an opinion which some women was shocking to some women at first, that just take our eyes off the guys and abandon them. And even if you did not want to be or could not be a lesbian, there was a certain freedom, and as far as she was concerned, really the only freedom that women could have would be by just recognizing that they were irrelevant, or making them irrelevant in our lives. And that essay, again, is Taking Our Eyes Off the Guys.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Thank you for talking about that essay. There's a lot of great essays in the book that I've just highlighted a couple of them, which actually next I'm going to start talking about some of the essays that I found particularly interesting and that articulate some radical feminist points, many of which have been neglected or that haven't been talked about since liberal feminists have come to dominate so much of feminist discourse. Next slide, please. So Catherine McKinnon, in her essay in this book, talks about, she kind of lays out some differences between what she calls liberalism and what she calls feminism, which we probably would have to modify as radical feminism at this point. She notes that liberalism is individualistic in its analysis, whereas feminism is socially based and critical. It has an analysis of power. Liberalism is naturalistic, which means it's, for example, attributes women's natural sexuality as the cause of women's participation in our oppression. It's natural for women to want to be nurturers at home, to do subservient work, to want to be dominated sexually. Liberalism is also voluntaristic in the liberal point of view. It's about women supposedly having choices, and that women choose these things because of our nature. How women are socialized is taken to be the natural state of women, and what choices women make are interpreted as our agency or our free will, and without looking at the constraints, of course. According to McKinnon, the feminist view, of course, is one is construed as women's nature is actually socially constructed. Women are raised to be subordinate, trained to be subordinate, disciplined, punished into being subordinate. Liberalism is based on idealism, and that means the philosophical view, meaning of that word, not like idealism, like achieving high ideals. So the philosophical meaning is in idealistic thinking, reality is determined by the ideas in your head. So your ideas are more important than what your reality is. A good way to describe that is, for a while, Oprah Winfrey was touting this book called The Secret, which talks about the law of attraction, which is the idea that if you think about certain things, you will attract them in your life. So if you think about money, you'll attract money. If you think of positive things, you'll attract positive things. On the contrary, if you think negative things, you'll attract negative things. Sadly, that's been taken to mean if negative things happen to you, it's because you pulled them in by thinking that way. So liberalism tends to think about, if you think of yourself as empowered, you'll have equality.
I
Obviously,
just committed a face crime.
Feminism is based on material reality. Actual access to material resources matter, like money, education, material help from other people, jobs, daycare, healthcare, transportation. That these things structure women's lives more than just believing that you're empowered. McKinnon says that liberalism is a watered down form of moralism, that it's based on what's good and bad with no analysis of power. Feminism, on the other hand, is an analysis that, as she says, is relentlessly about power and powerlessness. And finally, in liberalism, sexuality is private, not political. It's natural, and power relations or dominance have nothing to do with sexuality. And in her view, feminism sees that misogyny is sexualized, and that sexuality is premised on sex inequality. So what people feel sexually can be shaped and influenced by culture and by experiences with others. What turns people on is not free of choice and cultural influences, and is not free of the power dynamics of male supremacy. So you just have to think about it choking, someone suddenly becoming, super sexy, and obviously that's not something that is natural, but it's because of the way choking is done in pornography and is now pervading, unfortunately, many young people's sexual experiences. So that's an instance of sexuality being premised on sex inequality. Next slide, please. One of the chapters that I particularly liked was Sheila Jeffrey's Eroticizing Women's Subordination. She notes that many women experience subordination as eroticized, and she says that there's two typical reactions to that. One is feeling angry that such eroticization and oppression has entered our hearts and minds, as that kind of level of inculcation of our subordination has permeated our psyches. And the other is that women would be angry with feminists for pointing out that subordination is eroticized and for supposedly making them feel guilty for how they feel. She says again that women need a way to describe a difference between negative and positive sexual feelings. And she emphasizes that it is possible for women to transform our sexuality and to move toward more egalitarian ways of relating sexually. Next slide, please. Andrea Dworkin's chapter, Women Hating Right and Left. In this chapter, she wrote about pornography. I thought that it was kind of prophetic, given what we go through now with the internet and online activity. She says that, do you understand that once we're made into speech, we are owned as speech by men in the age of technology? Once we're technologized, once the abuse of us is technologized, we are legally their chattel. And she says the first step in resisting exploitation is recognizing it, seeing it, and knowing it, and not lying about it, which is what this book is about, rather than the liberal feminism idea, which embodies a lot of at least obfuscation, if not lies. The second step in resisting exploitation is caring about other women, all women. She wanted a return to what she calls primitive feminism. I thought she was particularly eloquent. She says that primitive feminism means that when something hurts women, feminists are against it. The hatred of women hurts women. Pornography is the hatred of women. Pornography hurts women. Feminists are against it, not for it. Next slide. Another chapter I thought was very interesting. Twist Butler wrote an essay on abortion and pornography, the sexual liberals' gotcha against women's equality. So she talks about how feminists at the time were told all the time by men that we're doing more harm than good when we insist on equal rights. She called those gotchas, as if men are saying, you want equality? We'll give you equality. So there was going to be some blowback, some clapback when we wanted equality. So when women argued for more fair divorce, or the right to get divorces without, no harm divorces, no fault divorces, that it meant that women would be more worse off economically after divorce. So you want divorce, fine, you're going to be poor. Or that feminist demands for limitations on pornography, which they were advocating for at the time, meant that, of course, that women's books and feminist books are going to be censored first. I remember that was talked about a lot. It's almost like a threat that if you try to get this one thing, we're going to pay you back with this bad thing. So in her essay, she kind of is talking about Alan Dershowitz, who was a very prominent civil rights attorney at the time, who opposed a lot of what the anti-pornography work. He was very opposed feminism in a lot of ways. Interestingly, he defended both O.J. Simpson and Jeffrey Epstein, and Virginia Giuffre, who just recently came out with her book, Nobody's Girl, sued him in 2019 for abusing her sexually, but later she dropped the suit, which I don't think it means she had nothing to say, that she had no grounds. It's obviously because of his position.
The Roe v. Wade, allowing for abortion, many attorneys at the time, and when it just got overturned, said we were afraid of this, making it, there was apparently some other way you could do it, some other legal argument that could have been made, but making it about privacy, a lot of lawyers were very, very worried about that. It's like this opens it up to be completely overturned by the Supreme Court. And when it was, they didn't, so much say "I told you so" as God. I was worried about that.
Right. And Butler points out that Dershowitz says that women's access to abortion depends on men's access to pornography. That's the gotcha. If we want abortion rights, and they're premised on privacy, then men have to have access to pornography, also premised on privacy. So that's the gotcha, and that's the connection between abortion rights and the men's access to pornography, which is, so in other words, we get abortion, but we have to pay with the exploitation and the abuse and subordination inherent in pornography. Next slide. Another chapter, this is Louise Armstrong, woman. Oh gosh, I have the wrong title for that. That is the title for Andrew Dworkin's chapter. I will have to, sorry, that's a mistake. I'll correct that at some point. It's in the table of contents, so I apologize. Anyway, Louise Armstrong talks about the invention of the incest mother, which was very prominent at the time, because that was the time when women were starting to talk about male sexual abuse of women. So the incest mother was defined as a woman who knew on some level, who supposedly colluded with the male perpetrator. In other words, they pretended they didn't know, but really they knew, and that those women chose the male over their children. It was a very prominent theme at the time. It was turned into an illness model by therapists who kind of saw it as an individual pathology and who lost sight of the power issues at play. Women therapists at that time only, and other people, looked at individual solutions, and there was no recognition of the systematic patterns that fostered or allowed sexual abuse of children by men. So it was just, basically it's the incest mother's fault. She's allowing it. It's focusing on that rather than on all the ways that men are empowered, financial and otherwise, the subordination of women, to be able to have access to their children sexually at home. Horrifically, the incest mother idea created a catch-22 for women whose male partners sexually abused their children. Oh, thank you so much for correcting that, Joe. I appreciate that. So the correct title is on the slide now, Making an Issue of Incest. Women who supposedly knew, so it turns out that women who did know or supposedly knew and didn't protect their children were vilified as at least partially, if not, very culpable. So they were just as bad as the men. On the other hand, because incest was starting to become an issue at that time, because of feminists brought to the fore, women who did know and tried to protect their children, often by keeping the children from visitation with the sexual abuser, were severely punished by the courts, and they often lost custody of their children to the sexual abuser. They were seen as engaging in what was called, and is still called, parental alienation. In other words, by pointing out that the man was sexually abusing their children, they were alienating the children from their father. So women were damned if they did, damned if they didn't. They were damned if they didn't know about the incest, because they really should have known, and they didn't protect their children. They were also severely punished if they did talk about it and try to keep their children safe. Next slide. So the last theme that kind of was in throughout the book that I thought was really interesting, because it's one of the things we don't talk about that much anymore. It's a very radical viewpoint, such a radical analysis, and women at various stages have had this analysis as to being sex resistors. They're willing to challenge the basic ideas that sex is good and wonderful at all times. So there's one essay in the book written by the Southern Women's Writing Collective called Sex Resistance in Heterosexual Relationships. They wrote, "We believe that the practice of the practice of sexuality politically subordinates women, that the entire practice must be dismantled, taken apart, or deconstructed." They also went so far as to say orgasm is oppressive to women. Sheila Jeffreys, in her chapter, Sexology and Anti-Feminism, cited two British feminist activists, Elizabeth Wolstenholme-Elmy and Frances Swinney, who advocated sex resistance. Both of these women campaigned for the fundamental women's rights to control their own bodies and to control access to their own bodies. They were opposed to sexual intercourse because they felt it was dangerous for women's health. It led to unwanted pregnancies. It forced contraception use, which they felt reduces women to objects for men's use. Sexual intercourse humiliated women and made them into things. And it showed men's dominance, which should only be done for reproduction and rarely. Finally, Dorchen Leidholdt, in her essay, notes that if the sex in question is the sex men use to establish their dominance over women, then yes, we're against it. So I found that particularly interesting because it's kind of taboo, or it's certainly very few women are willing to say that there's a problem with sex, that how, we're all supposed to say that sex is great and we love it. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but it's just interesting that some women have gone the opposite route. And I think it's interesting to even think about. There's lots more to this book. Every single chapter adds something to the analysis of radical feminism at the time. I think it's an excellent primer on radical feminism that gets at the root of the ongoing problems of liberalism, liberal feminism, and sex liberalism that continue to this day and are so prevalent throughout, what mainstream feminism as it stands. Okay, that's it.
So there have been sex resistors. I mean, in China, there was a movement for sex, for resisting sex and things like that. And if sex is used to support male dominance over women, then then it shouldn't be done. I mean, there shouldn't be any sex. And you know, and when I was reading that chapter, and a lot of these, is that male sexuality is essentially all about dominance and violation. And it may be just mild, you know, I'm the, you know, the big guy and I take control. It may be mild and seemingly, you know, relatively benevolent, but it's usually more very specifically about dominance and violation. So I mean, there are some points in this book, and certainly, and again, Sonia Johnson is particularly great about that, that it's all about dominance. It's all about dominance. So should women not be having sex at all? Some early feminists said, no, we shouldn't. And we're roundly criticized for it.
I see Jane Hamilton in the chat brings up the 4B movement in South Korea, which also is, you know, against sex with men.
Any other questions right now? There was one comment earlier. It's like, is there any, when you were talking about the whisper and the coyote movements? Yeah, is there, you know, is there any organization that doesn't do this? And again, God, I loved Sonia Johnson. I heard her speak a few times. It just and she was just like, no. I mean, that's what it's all about. And that's why men aren't going to change things. So why should you know, why should they change? They're getting what they want out of it.
Yeah, it's really impressive how, in a bad way, how liberal feminism and sex liberalism has taken over so much of feminism. And actually, next week on Feminist Question Time, I'm going to be talking about the ways women's studies has completely embraced those kinds of philosophies as well.
Sheila is here. Sheila Jeffries is here. And you know, I think it might be apropos to, you know, to have the author of one of the essays in the book, who in fact inspired the whole thing, to give us a couple of comments on why you felt this conference was necessary, and what your essay really emphasized.
Yes, thanks, sisters. It's lovely to hear this book discussed, because I think it is very important. In the mid-80s, I was in the US for a year on a scholarship teaching at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And my first book had just come out. Splinter and Enemy came out in 95. So women were becoming aware of me, and I spent that year trying to meet up with them. And I met up with Jan Raymond and Catherine McKinnon, and I, you know, went to all the talks they were doing, because it was the time when the anti-pornography ordinance was created by Dworkin and McKinnon, and talks were being given all over the country. And I went to those talks, and I met at those talks women from Women Against Pornography in New York, particularly Dorhen Leidholdt. And that was the time when Women Against Pornography New York created the anti-pornography slideshow, with all these extraordinary slides of women being put through meat grinders and so on, which I got and took back to Britain, and I was showing them in Britain as well. And so the slideshow was being shown everywhere as well. So it was a really, really important time when lots of very significant and wonderful feminists in the US were fighting back against sexual liberalism, against the rise of pornography, and they'd created the anti-pornography ordinance. So there was a great deal going on at the same time as of being absolutely horrified by the development of sadomasochism, by the development of what were called sort of pro-pornography feminism, as if you could have pro-pornography feminism. So it was an absolute battle royal, and there were all these wonderful feminists involved in fighting it. So I probably did say that there should be a conference about it, that women should be brought together when I was talking with Dorchen and the other women at WAP New York. And I believe that the title was mine. I supplied the title Sexual Liberals and the Attack on Feminism because I felt that that was what was going on in these so-called sex wars in the mid-80s. We were losing feminism to all these anti-feminist, pro-men's violent sexuality politics. Anyway, the conference itself, I was back in Britain by then, and New York Women Against Pornography organized it. And so I had to fly out there to go to the conference and speak at the conference. And it was absolutely marvelous. It was marvelous to see Andrea Dworkin speak at that conference. And it was the first time that I met a women's security team, because she had to have security there in particular, as did others, of course. Because she was Andrea was getting huge attacks at the time, huge attacks, and we were a bit worried, but not really physical attacks, not like now. There weren't men protesting outside and doing physical attacks in the way they are now. But it was marvelous to meet all of those women. I have to say, it was a fantastic conference, and the politics were so strong then and so well developed theoretically as well. Women, not necessarily academics, were all writing these splendid papers and getting together in groups and writing material like the Wazzies did, the Women Against Sex. And it was an extraordinary time. I mean, what is marvelous is that not only are we having this talk today to bring it all back for a new generation, but that we have got the PDFs online. So even though it's not in print, you can get the book. We do have some of the talks online as well, and we put the links into that. So at that extraordinary time, it is possible for women to revisit and see what was going on. And I do think we need to revisit it and be aware of what was going on, because very many in this new struggle against transgenderism are not aware of how it fits in and what it fits into. And of course, as Karla was saying today, the creation of all these men's perversions as what sex was and should be has led to, with the development of pornography, the transgenderism that we get today, which is just one of those perversions and a product of that pornography. So it fits very well into this huge turnaround and defeat of feminism. I think, unfortunately, it was a defeat of feminism, even though there was all that marvelous work and all those marvelous women creating materials for us that we can still look at. I think we were defeated. And indeed, in 1984, Gail Rubin, the lesbian sadomasochist, wrote about how transgenderism was, revolutionary. So was pedophilia, and so on and so on and so on. And her piece on that then got produced in all these anthologies of gay and lesbian politics. She was absolutely celebrated because, of course, she did the men's politics of eroticizing violence and dominance and submission. So yes, it was a hugely important time, and this book represents the extraordinary ferment around whether sex was political. We know it is, of course, but at the time it was just seen as freedom, as a form of extraordinary freedom.
I think this book is important because when you look at the way sexual liberalism did win in a way, and I think that is what gave rise to this idea that you talked about, Sheila, in your essay, that sexual minorities are the people that need most liberating, which explains the ties between transgenderism and pedophilia, because it's all about sexual minorities and this liberation of people having all kinds of sexualities is more important than, looking at considerations of equality, dignity, humanity, and egalitarian existence between women and men, or just between women. so to me, it's this break, what happened, it fueled everything that came after it and that we're dealing with now.
There, there were women back then who knew Andrea Dworkin. God bless her. She just kept doing everything she was doing, but she knew I was at the in New York City at the Women Against Pornography March in 1979, and somebody said, "Hey, look, there's Andrea Dworkin." So, I ran over to her and I thanked her, for everything she was doing, and talked for a few minutes, and I said, "Is there anything else we could be doing?" And she just looked really sad and said, "It's going to get so much worse before it gets better, if it ever gets better, but never give up. Never
Yeah.
give up." I've never forgotten that. Never give up.
I wonder how much, thinking about the ideas of idealism versus materialism, how much of our, maybe not defeat, but, that radical feminism didn't go as what we would have wanted is because women didn't at the time, and perhaps still don't, have access to the material resources, financial independence, all kinds of things women need to be able to think independently and be independent enough. Because I think that when you're really financially constrained, for many women, the way out of that is marriage to a man. And so once you're married to a man, you can't think freely. You can't think these ideas. But if we had more material resources, if women were able to get more material resources, would women be able to think more radical feminist thoughts without, would they be free to have those thoughts? And just thinking, I'm wondering, what do you all think about that idea?
Early on, a lot of what the women's liberation movement did, it was liberation. We wanted to be liberated from patriarchy, and a lot of what was done was very material things. You couldn't open a bank account. Well, now you can open a bank account. You couldn't have a credit card. Now you can have a credit card. Childcare at work. Opening up of other jobs to women that weren't available, and some very, very practical things like this. Domestic violence centers without men wearing dresses as the counselors, but real domestic violence, rape crisis counseling, all of that. And that was very good practical stuff that allowed women, if they wanted to walk away from an abusive man, to walk away from a setting that was bad for her, that was bad for her children. And that was, early things that radical feminists did, but along the way it kind of got co-opted as like, a liberal sort of thing. It's like, and it
got therapized too.
Yeah, it got therapized. Any other questions? Let's see. Kate Newey is saying that her female undergraduates are very, very hungry for this material, and that they do think about these issues, which I'm very grateful for. And one thing, Sheila, that I need to say is that I love that you used the phrase eroticization of subordination. That really is, when I was a kid and we heard about pornography, I remember thinking when I was like 14 years old, well, if it has to do with violence and there's a woman involved, that should never be allowed. And that was a pretty 14-year-old way of looking at it, but it's kind of fundamental to what pornography is and how it damages women. Any other comments? Karla, Sheila.
Could you just say, in response to what Kate Newey was saying, which is that she has undergraduates who are thirsting for this. Well, we have had at Cambridge University the creation of the first women-only group, a feminist group by 3 women who are getting a lot of shit, but also loads of huge enthusiasm and getting lots of young women joining them. I am assuming, we have to assume that's going to happen at universities all over the country now, that young women are going to, as students, revolt. When I first went in 1991 to the University of Melbourne to teach, it was because the students the female students had demanded feminism and had demanded feminist courses. So they had to get me. They looked for me and they got me. So let's hope that this will start again, because it is really, really important that women are able to find these ideas and that the ideas do go again into universities. So that gives me hope. And it gives me hope that Kate is saying this about her students. I mean, that really is a bit of an inspiration. The Cambridge students are an inspiration, but imagine that we've had to wait this long and be so enthusiastic because just 3 women have created a proper feminist group at a university. Incredible, but they have.
It's wonderful.
One thing that gives me a tiny bit of hope is we just had a big election in the United States, and the gender gap in voting is widening and widening. Women are voting. It's sad that men are voting terrible, but women are voting very different from men. So it does at least make me think that there is a difference in consciousness and this is true especially of young women, that between young women and how they're seeing the world.
Yes. And women in middle years are there's a trend to stop dating men because the men are so dreadful and so dreadfully constructed through the pornography they'd read. So women are just stopping dating, which is terrific. And women are stopping having children, of course. There's a huge problem of children not being created by the class that's supposed to create them internationally. So there are some big trends going on out there suggesting a disengagement with and a disillusionment of women with their situation in heterosexuality and with men, which is fascinating. And that's not necessarily created by feminism, but it's something serious that's going on and will allow potentially feminism to develop.
Yeah.
Right. We're almost done. We have a few more minutes. Does anybody have any burning desires in terms of questions in the chat, or Karla, Sheila? I'm so glad to have read this book. I got it like when it first came out and read it when it first came out and had really forgotten it. So I'm very glad we were able to do it, and I had the opportunity to read it again. Shall we have somebody asks
Group name.
a group name, The Disillusionment of Women? Well, let's call it something else. Let's call it Zena's Army or something.
Oh, Job is pointing out that there's a question: why is WDI women only? That's a big topic.
Because men have no place among us for what we are trying to do.
Men are a distraction, and the men change the dynamics. And I think we absolutely need women-only spaces.
This is
completely
what we're doing.
Different.
Is for women, by women, and about women, and men have no place in anything that is for or about women.
Yeah, it's men completely change the dynamic, and it's interesting that women sometimes don't notice that. But if you do stop and notice, you can see where if men are in a group, the dynamic is different than when it's just women. There's a freedom that's there.
Yeah, and somebody said, we don't have to explain, which is really ultimately the answer is like, why do you want this? Because we say so.
Yeah.
All right. It's just about time. Thank you all very much for being here. Karla, that was really excellent. And thanks for really the linchpin of all this when the book was published, Sheila, for commenting as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Sheila.
Thanks to everybody.
Yes, thanks, sisters.